Hello again, everybody. I'm back with a new video. This video is going to expand and build upon my most recent video, which, if you will recall, had to do with Playgirl magazine in The Shining. In this previous video, I attempted to make the case that the appearance of this particular issue of Playgirl magazine in The Shining is of significance and deserves to be looked into further by researchers of this movie. I've spent some time looking into this subject, and I found some things that I think fans of this movie and fans of Stanley Kubrick in general will be very interested in, and it is the purpose of this video to share these things with you in the hope that it will be at least be thought-provoking or interesting. Now, believe it or not, there's actually quite a bit to share with you here. So much, in fact, that it's going to require multiple videos. I won't be able to include it all in one part. So this is part one of a series of videos. I don't know how many parts it will take, but probably a lot. So with that, let's get started. Before we do get started, however, there are a few things that you need to be aware of. And that is the material and subject matter that's going to be covered and analyzed in this video series is very closely related to the material covered in a previous video series I created called Kubrick's Catcher in the Rye Code in The Shining. And I think it's very important that you be at least somewhat familiar with this video series, Kubrick's Catcher in the Rye Code. So before you proceed any further with this video series, I encourage you to go back and look at that video series. It's a 6-part video series if you have not already done so. However, if you don't feel like doing that, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is give you a very abbreviated and perfunctory summary of the key points which will be necessary for you to follow along. The first key point has to do with the numbers 10 and 42. These two numbers pop up in various places during the course of The Shining, and they are very important in order to make the connection between the movie and the message which I claim Kubrick is trying to reveal to us. The second key point to understand is the importance of the novel The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. When we first see Jack Torrance, she is reading this book, and I demonstrate furthermore that Kubrick has called special attention to 3 particular pages in this book, pages 132, 133, and 134. And I also demonstrate that Kubrick uses these 3 pages to construct a message for us, which you can follow along in part 2 of this video series. The third key point I want to go over has to do with the Rothschild banking family, which is based in the UK. As I demonstrate in part 3 of the video series Kubrick's Catcher in the Rye Code, a lot of the imagery we see in this movie is alluding to the Rothschild family crest, as you can see there. Furthermore, I demonstrate that Kubrick is calling attention to one particular member of the Rothschild family, and that is Nathaniel Charles Rothschild, or better known as just simply Charles Rothschild, who committed suicide at the age of 46 in 1923. The next key point I want to go over has to do with the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright and the massacre which occurred at his Taliesin compound near Spring Green, Wisconsin. On August 15, 1914, there was a massacre which occurred at this place, with the result being that 7 people were killed, including Frank Lloyd Wright's love interest at the time, a woman named Mama Borthwick Cheney, and her 2 small children. this table demonstrates the aspects of The Shining which mirror that of the Taliesin Massacre, and it's my belief that The Shining is really a vehicle for Stanley Kubrick to tell the truth about this event. The fifth key point is the actual message itself, which Kubrick constructed using The Catcher in the Rye. With this message, he is clearly pointing the finger at the Rothschilds as being responsible for the Taliesin Massacre. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a very abbreviated and bare-bones summary of some of the key points that I went over in the previous video series that I've been alluding to. In the video series Kubrick's Catcher in the Rye Code, I go into a lot of detail to justify these assertions that I've been showing you. So before you pass any value judgments as to the validity of what I've just said here, again I urge you to view that series if you have the time. So now let's get started with the main point of this video. When I was looking at this issue of Playgirl magazine in this movie, I couldn't help but be struck by this picture of Jack Torrance reading the magazine, as you can see here. What specifically struck me was the fact that we have seen something similar to this earlier in the movie. Recall that, again, that the first time we see Wendy Torrance, she is reading a book. She's reading The Catcher in the Rye. And furthermore, Kubrick makes it possible for us to determine precisely which pages she was looking at that time. And it was this revelation which ultimately led to the discovery of the message which Kubrick had embedded in this book, which I have alluded to earlier, where Kubrick is implicating the Rothschilds as being responsible for the massacre at Taliesin. So one can say that by having Wendy Torrance reading this book the first time we see her, Kubrick is trying to call our attention to this book. He's trying to tell us that there's something in this book that he wants us to see. Following this train of thought, it's natural to ask the question, by having Jack Torrance actually reading Playgirl magazine, as we see here, is Kubrick trying to draw our attention to something in this magazine? Is there something in this magazine that Kubrick wants us to see? It's an interesting and intriguing question, and after giving it some thought, I decided that the only way to really answer this question was to actually get this magazine, this particular issue, and look through it and see if that is indeed the case. So that's what I did. Fortunately, it's possible to still purchase this particular issue. It wasn't cheap. I think, if I remember correctly, after shipping and handling and taxes and all that, it came to about $70. But I got it, and just so you know, don't feel sorry for me, because I can tell you right now, it was worth every penny. Once you have this magazine to peruse, you're faced with the challenge of determining what exactly or where exactly in this magazine should you look for something, if anything, that Kubrick wants us to see. This is easier said than done, because this particular issue of Playgirl has over 120 pages in it, so you're faced with the task of basically trying to find a needle in a haystack, potentially. Furthermore, when you watch this particular part of The Shining, Kubrick doesn't give us any helpful clues, as he did in the case of Wendy Torrance and The Catcher in the Rye. However, when you look at this image of Jack Torrance reading the magazine, there are a couple observations you can make which are potentially helpful. One observation you can make is that Jack Torrance appears to be reading, or actually looking at, a page which is on the left-hand side of the magazine. The second observation you can make has to do with where in the magazine he's reading. When you look at the portion of the magazine which is in Jack Torrance's right hand and compare it to that which is in his left hand, you can come to the conclusion, or you can deduce, that he's reading a page which is at the beginning portion of the magazine. And this is interesting because this is typically where you will find letters to the editor in a magazine such as Playgirl. With these things in mind, I want to call your attention to this particular portion of the magazine. There are several things going on here that I want to highlight for you. The first thing to take note of is that page 10, as you can see there in the lower left, is on the left-hand side of the magazine, which is the side of the magazine we see Jack Torrance reading. Another interesting point, I think, is that when you look at that advert on the bottom half of the page, you can see that on the left-hand side there is a lion, which is interesting because on the Rothschild family crest you can also find a lion on the left-hand side. And finally, we also see the word English, as in English leather. And this is another reference, I believe, to the Rothschilds. Keep in mind, they are based in the UK. So these are interesting and potentially promising observations. So the next step here is to look elsewhere on this page to see if there's anything else here of note. And by that I'm referring to the letters, which you can see here on the top half of the page. So I remember reading these letters and not really finding anything super obvious, or even anything even remotely obvious concerning our connection to Stanley Kubrick or The Shining or the Rothschilds or any of that. However, when I started reading these letters carefully, one of them really stuck out to me here, and it's this one, titled Beneath My Yurt. When you read this letter and think about what is being said here, there's some really odd features to this letter, and I've highlighted them here. For example, the writer talks about how he lost a car. He just parked it somewhere and then he forgot about it or whatever, and then he lost it. And then he makes statements such as crawling around under furniture for hours looking for lost items. The whole thing is just sort of goofy. And as I was reading this letter, trying to make sense of it, I remember getting this feeling of déjà vu, as if I had read something like this before.
I mean, we all have moments of déjà vu, but this was ridiculous.
To drive home the point of what I'm trying to make here, I'd like you to do the following very simple exercise. First, find a copy of The Catcher in the Rye. It doesn't matter what edition, any edition will do. And randomly pick out a spot in that book and then read 4 or 5 pages. And then immediately after that, go back to that Beneath My Yurt letter that I've been talking about, and then read that letter. Repeat that exercise for a few times, and then I think you will come to the same realization that I did, and that is this letter here, Beneath My Yurt, was written in the style and voice and mannerisms of Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye. And from my perspective, this is significant because, again, recall that it's my contention that Stanley Kubrick used The Catcher in the Rye to provide us with that message which, again, he implicated the Rothschilds in the Taliesin massacre. So this letter started to intrigue me, and naturally I wanted to find out if there was anything else in this letter which we could connect to The Shining. And one of the things that I looked into had to do with the number 42. Keep in mind that this letter appears on page 10 of Playgirl. It occurred to me that maybe this letter might be 42 lines in length. So as you can see here, I counted the lines, and it turns out that this letter is actually 45 lines long. So that was somewhat of a dead end. However, keep in mind that that text I've highlighted in the green there was added by the editors. It was not part of the original letter. So it occurred to me, well, maybe if you take out that text, then maybe this letter would be 42 lines long. So to test out this theory, I recreated this letter in a Word document. As you can see here, this is 45 lines long. And then what I did was I simply deleted that text there in the red. And when I did that, as you can see, what we ended up with was a letter that was 43 lines long. So close, but no cigar. So that was a bit disappointing. However, the main point I want to get to here is that this exercise caused me to focus a bit on that very last line there, Pawnee Mission, Kansas. I didn't know anything about this place, so on a whim I just decided to look it up and just see what I could see. And when I did that, I came to sort of a confusing and startling discovery, and that is there is no city or town in Kansas called Pawnee Mission. As you can see in this partial list of cities and towns in Kansas, Pawnee Mission just isn't there. Now, there is a county in Kansas called Pawnee, but again, there is no city or town in Kansas called Pawnee Mission. So this is odd, to say the least. So I turned my attention back to this Patrick LeBrun from the non-existent Pawnee Mission, Kansas, and I realized that the abbreviation for Kansas, the K and the S, can be rearranged to form the initials of Stanley Kubrick. And it's at this point when I start getting another feeling of deja vu. Because remember, in the previous video series I created, Kubrick's Catcher in the Rye Code, I went through a lot of time and trouble of rearranging letters to form the message that Stanley Kubrick had created. And so, looking at these words here, Patrick LeBrun and SK, I realized that these letters could be rearranged to form the name Stanley Kubrick. Now I'm sure that some, if not all of you, are looking at this and thinking to yourself, well, now wait a minute, before you start triumphantly proclaiming that Stanley Kubrick wrote this letter, you are missing the letter Y. And obviously that's true, and I can tell you on a personal note that having gone through this, I remember feeling the same feeling of disappointment I felt when I was unable to prove that this letter had 42 lines instead of 43 or 45. And I remember, I guess in a feeling of sort of semi-desperation, thinking, well, maybe Stanley Kubrick set up this puzzle here so that instead of spelling out Stanley with a Y, he meant to just spell out the word Stan, as in short for Stanley. But then at some point I looked up right above the letters we used from Patrick LeBrun, and I realized that in the word Playgirl is the letter Y, and it's right there, right next to the other letters we used. Now, some of you may object to using this letter Y because, after all, it's in the main body of this letter, and it's not in the I guess this what you would call the signature part of the letter. And that may be true, but in a few minutes I intend to try and make the case that the placement of this letter Y is Kubrick's way of offering us a clue as to how to proceed from this point. But before I do that, what I want to do is pause here and take stock of the situation and summarize, in my opinion, what is going on here. The fundamental question motivating this video is, why is this issue of Playgirl magazine in The Shining? Based on the preceding analysis, we can make the following conclusions here. This issue of Playgirl magazine is in The Shining because on page 10 of this issue is this letter, which was written by Stanley Kubrick. He's using the voice and mannerisms of Holden Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, and he's using the pseudonym Patrick LeBrun from the non-existent city or town of Pawnee Mission, Kansas. And the fact that Kubrick has resorted to these tactics of subterfuge, I believe, gives us an indication as to what we should look for going forward in this letter. At this point, I want to point out a couple things here, and that is, in spelling out the name Stanley Kubrick, we still have some letters left over from the words Playgirl, Patrick LeBrun, and we haven't even touched Pawnee Mission. This implies to me that there are other words besides the name Stanley Kubrick that are meant to be decoded from this letter. Furthermore, the fact that we had to use the Y from Playgirl, which is in the main body of the letter and separate from the other words that we use to make the name Stanley Kubrick, implies to me that there are other words in the main body of the letter which we should consider using. So the situation as I see it is this. Playgirl magazine is in The Shining because Kubrick wants us to discover a message that he has hidden in this Beneath My Yurt letter on page 10. And at this point, what we need to do is determine which words in this letter are to be included in the decoding process. So that is going to be the next task I'm going to focus on here. This will be done in the next part of this video series, part 2, coming up real soon, and it should be very interesting, and I hope you stay tuned. See you then.